Welcome to the Word. Series 2. St. Paul the Apostle. St. Paul the Apostle, originally named Saul of Tarsus, was a key figure in the early Christian church and one of the most influential missionaries of Christianity. He was a Jewish Pharisee who initially persecuted Christians but experienced a dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus. After his conversion, he dedicated his life to spreading the gospel, particularly among Gentiles, non-Jews. Paul traveled extensively, establishing Christian communities across the Roman Empire, including modern-day Turkey, Greece, and Rome. His letters, epistles, to these communities, such as Romans, Corinthians, and Galatians, form a significant part of the New Testament and provide theological foundations for Christian belief. In this series, Father Benoit Standaert unpacks the writings of this beloved apostle, St. Paul.
Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Dear friends, this morning I would like to deal with you a kind of portrait of Paul. We try to compose a somehow inspiring portrait of the apostle. We have, of course, his letters, and they will verify what will we find elsewhere. We have also the beautiful narrative of Luke in Acts. In that book, more or less the second part of the Acts, or the Acts of Paul. In the first part, mainly the Acts of Peter. Now, only in the 2nd century we get a real biography and complete narrative of the life of Paul by a priest who lived in what we call today Turkey, in Asia Minor, we can call it. And that priest, around 150, describes under the title The Acts of Paul and Thecla. And in the middle of that narrative, there is a rather old portrait of Paul, written more than a century after the death of the apostle, or more or less a century after his death. All the painters of icons of Paul go back and take their inspiration from that page, conserved in this apocryphal book called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. I read you a short passage. Titus had described the exterior aspect of Paul as Onesiphorus did not know him physically, only spiritually. So you see the transmission. The priest is telling what he has heard from Onesiphorus. And Onesiphorus received what we will hear from Titus, who describes it. And Titus is a direct disciple, coming from that regio of central Turkey. He saw Paul arriving. He was a man of middling size, and his hair was scanty, and his legs were a little crooked, and his knees were projecting. And he had large eyes, and his eyebrows met, and his nose was somewhat long, and he was full of grace and mercy. At one time he seemed like a man, and at another time he seemed like an angel. When he saw Onesiphorus, Paul smiled. That's the end of this short, old portrait of Paul, and the way he is described will be respected over the centuries in all the mosaics and frescoes and icons depicting Paul. Let us develop a second approach, starting from the cube of Heymans. We have already used that cube when we were speaking about Luke. The cube is made up by 3 axes, and the character of a person is in position for these 3 axes. There is an axe of activity or non-activity. So you can be very low in an active attitude or extremely active, that is the opposition on one of the axes. The same about emotivity. You can be non-emotive or highly emotive. And a third category is you have a primary reaction to everything, or you are, with a certain delay, secondary. And these are extremes. And so you compose a typical cube out of these 3 axes. And that means that there are in the cube 8 types with a synthetical name. The name is not so important. The important thing is the combination of secondarity with emotivity and with or without activity. This is the work of the Dutch philosopher and psychologist Heymans just 1 century ago, 1921. It has been taken over by the French philosopher René Le Sen in his very famous Traité de caractérologie that was written about 20 years later in 1945. And in both, Paul may be considered a passionate personality, which implies the threefold conjunction of active, emotive, and secondary. A temperament of fire, he has depth because of his secondarity. He let us enter in his intimate side of personality, more than anybody else in the New Testament. And we see it consequently that most of the church fathers, like John Chrysostom or Augustine, will verify their own interiority and spiritual experience in the writings of the apostle. He has a large view because of this secondarity and combined this emotivity. He sees far before him, and in his way of arguing, he does never forget the end of what he wants to reach, even if he interrupts by digressions his longer exposés. He can speak 3-4 chapters, even in Romans, for instance, 8 chapters at once, but he will interrupt by digressions and then come back on his argument because he is secondary. He doesn't forget the line and the goal of his argumentation. Also, the anacolutes, where he breaks the grammatical structure of a sentence and open it for explaining a second thought, give a good illustration of his temperament as emotive, with warm elements. And the active character, combined with the secondary one, makes that he knows how to motivate his audience in a program of action, using arguments from the good sense, from the Torah, or even taking from the teachings of Jesus. We may observe in what he, in 1 Corinthians 9, argues that a worker merits his salary. You find examples in the Old Testament, you find examples in the tradition of Jesus. Also in 2 Corinthians 8-9, he encourages the same Corinthians to be generous for the collect, organized for the poor brothers in the community of Jerusalem. He has plenty of arguments, that is his intelligent mind and large memory of a secondary, but in function of an action, the collection itself is an invention where he, in a practical way, organizes that week after week the Corinthians bring something and help the brothers in Jerusalem. Another element that is typical for him and is the fruit of this combination of the three is that he is a well-educated thinker, but in a dialectical way. He never simply abounds in one sense against the other. He's not a man of a party, never. But he works out a double appreciation of opposed views and points to a third position beyond. So he can state that circumcision is nothing, and not being circumcised is of no value. But what is really important is to become a new creation. He develops that in Galatians 5:6 and 6:15, and these are three steps. He shows the no value of a circumcision no more, and the no value of not being circumcised. But he brings the argument until the third level, and that is to be a new creation. But that means that it is precious to read him in large sections, so that the three moments of this dialectical mind have been heard, and not just one of them, if at least we want to understand him carefully. Secondarity and emotivity working together in him give to his mind a rich approach to all questions, sometimes in a bit tormented, but ultimately free and integrating positively differences and oppositions. The many polarities in a community, the rigorists and the laxists, the so-called strong and the weak, receive in his teaching a chance to exist together, but sometimes with the difficult task to integrate points of the other's view. But Paul is able to that and offer this. And in the school of Paul, we learn to be appreciative even of the differences, and we can go over the distinction to be conservative or to be liberal. This easy etiquette is not at all the mind of Paul, even if he will be considered by conservatives as liberal in general. His mind, because of this secondarity and emotivity, is larger and is an education in wisdom beyond the polarities that we can develop in life. Still, no, we are not finished. I have still one paragraph.
Oh.
Yeah, the Enneagram. Huh? Yeah, you will have to bring that closer to one another. Yes?
Yes. Continue.
As last approach for a portrait of Paul, I would go back to another typology with ancient roots and known today as the Enneagram. We have beautiful books by Richard Rohr and Andreas Ebert, or also by Maria Biesing and Robert Nogosek and Patrick O'Leary. Each time the title The Enneagram. There is a lot of literature on the internet. The human condition is distributed over 3 major faculties. Each man has a heart, an intellect, and a belly or instinct. These 3 poles have each 3 types or characters that are designated in a simple way by a number. So you have number 2 and 3 and 4, who are types centered around the heart. And the strongest of these 3 is number 3, the middle of the 3. Round the intellect, we have 5, 6, and 7. And the strong type of it is the 6. And the last 3 is the 8, the 9, and the 1. And they belong to the instinct. The 9 being in the center of that. More or less in the middle of one's life, that is around 40 years, everybody has made his or her choice. I want to be someone starting and coming always back on the level of heart, or intellect mainly, or instinct first of all, and dominant center of my personality. Let us remember that the important thing is not just to be a 2 or a 7, but to be a liberated 2, a liberated 1, a relaxed 3, a 9 at home in his type, knowing the possible immature forms of one's own type. Now, in the manuals, you get behind the numbers a qualification. I give it you in a certain hurry, but type 1 is the reformer, perfectionist. Type 2 is the helper, universal helper. Type 3 is the achiever. Everything is always lacking in his vision. He achieves. Type 4 is the individualist, the artist. He will always contest that he is 4 because he is not a number, he is exceptional. Type 5 is the investigator with a large view, and his whole life he's still in research. He never finishes his doctor's thesis. Type 6 is the loyalist. Type critical and fearing the dangers before all the others, but loyal to the system. Type 7 is the enthusiast, the Mozart, the one who repeats, there are no problems. Type 8 is heavy in the discussion, is the challenger, serious, heavy. And type 9 is here mistaken. He said the reformer. It should not be the reformer, but rather the peacemaker. The peacemaker. I don't know why they... Excuse me. I come back. After the challenger, we have in type 9 the peacemaker. In one of the typologies, they present Pope John XXIII as a typical 9. Secondary and behind. Where do we put Paul in this new other system or typology? Without much hesitation, we see the commentators at home in this approach to qualify Paul as a typical 1, called often as the perfectionist, attracted by idealism. Paul himself has presented his person as a zealot, as a Pharisee living with a very strict observance of all the rules of life according to the Pharisaic model. We hear him saying how he was progressed in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my race, since I was even more a zealot for my ancestral traditions. He says that in Galatians 1:14, when he describes his life before his conversion. The same characteristic appears in Philippians 3. The beginning of the chapter, he describes himself, in observance of the law, I was a Pharisee. In zeal, I persecuted the church. In righteousness based on the law, I was blameless. You see his image is colored, of course, but with positive elements of a very observant zealot, and at the same time with the negative aspect that he was able to be intolerant and persecute the church. He persecutes members of the new Christian movement, even killing them, as happened with Stephanus. He stood there. Of course, in his perfection, he was not allowed to stone Stephanus. Only people with dirty hands were allowed to do that, and he had clean hands. But he supported them and he controlled the clothes of those who killed Stephanus. And he agreed with that. Paul had to move and to develop so that he could become a liberated one. It is the meeting with the risen Lord Jesus on his way to Damascus that has provoked an essential crisis in his first view on perfection. And everything had to be reconsidered in his Pharisaic system. Slowly, he has accepted to be loved not because of some merits, but pure by grace. He became, in this way, as we have seen, a doctor caritatis, where love is in the center of his vision, and not just observances of many rules in the law and perfectionism in achieving them. One day, his perfectionism had to die, but not suddenly. When he presents himself at the end of the list of the apostles in 1 Corinthians 15, he says how he worked hard, even more than all the other apostles. But immediately he corrects that view, adding, not I, but the grace of God in me. Verse 10 of chapter 15 in 1 Corinthians. The perfect grammar of his new identity is expressed in Galatians 2. I live, not I, but Christ is living in me. My actual life in the flesh, in the human condition, I do live it in the faith in the Son of God, who has loved me and given himself for me. In Philippians he says, I am capable of everything. And there you hear the first zealot. But I am capable of everything in him who has given me his dunamis, his power. The first Paul is not destroyed, but converted in a free personality, breathing the love of God in his heart. Now, a little enrichment of his portrait. Normally, those 9 types are related to one another. And normally, a 1 should look in direction of the 7 to come to harmony. And the 7 is Mozart. Someone said, Karl Barth, the big, great theologian, the Swiss theologian, Protestant, at the beginning of last century, every morning he started by listening to Mozart. And Mozart is a typical 7. So we can see in the correspondence with the Corinthians the role of Titus. Titus goes and Paul remains in Macedonia. He's afraid to go to see again the community of Corinth because he is no more number 1 in the eyes of many of them. Apollos has stolen his success, and Titus is the bridge. And Titus is capable of reporting the feelings of Paul and reporting the feelings of the community so that Paul is reconciled. Titus is a typical 7. If we look to Luke, Luke is a typical 4 with his large book that he has written as an artist. 4 is the artist, unique. And the 4 should look to the 1. And you see that Luke is in a certain way with his camera on his knees to take the film of the life of Paul. So he looks to the 1 with admiration. That is his ideal. In the Acts of the Apostles, you have the founding groups of the 12. But the model for us is not strictly spoken an apostle for Luke, but is a witness. And the witness of Paul is example for the witness we should do in our new context today. Timothy is in the neighborhood of Paul and presented several times. Well, Timothy should be a 2. A 2 is a helper. And he is close. He has a relationship with the 1 as an ale of him. And Paul could also build on the qualities of the 2 of Timothy. Matthew has integrated Paul. Matthew should be a 9, a phlegmatic, rich type, can integrate everything. He can also integrate the energy of Paul with his zealot as a Pharisee and with his corrected zealot. And James, we have heard about James when Paul arrives in Jerusalem. It was probably the most difficult relation for Paul. Not Peter, but James. And James must be a 6. a loyal one who wanted to be accepted by the Pharisees, that Christian movement should be respectful to all the traditional ways of living religiously in the Pharisees sect. And Paul was a Pharisee who had abandoned that, who had seen that this is spiritually poor, that the new spirituality is by receiving the Spirit from the risen Lord and walk according to that Spirit. So if we look to James, we must put him in the groups of the six, the loyal one, who respects the rules and who wanted a Christianity that follows the model of life of the Pharisees. In many ways, this was the opposition of Paul, who is a converted Pharisee. He knows everything about the Pharisees, but left that behind him. And these two stood as polarities in the figure of the 9 types, the 6 and the 1.
Welcome to the Word. Series 2. St. Paul the Apostle. St. Paul the Apostle, originally named Saul of Tarsus, was a key figure in the early Christian church and one of the most influential missionaries of Christianity. He was a Jewish Pharisee who initially persecuted Christians but experienced a dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus. After his conversion, he dedicated his life to spreading the gospel, particularly among Gentiles, non-Jews. Paul traveled extensively, establishing Christian communities across the Roman Empire, including modern-day Turkey, Greece, and Rome. His letters, epistles, to these communities, such as Romans, Corinthians, and Galatians, form a significant part of the New Testament and provide theological foundations for Christian belief. In this series, Father Benoit Standaert unpacks the writings of this beloved apostle. St. Paul.